Brahmanda Purana, Part 5. Publisher's Note. The purest gems lie hidden in the bottom of the ocean or in the depth of rocks. One has to dive into the ocean or delve into the rocks to find them out. Similarly, truth lies concealed in the language which, with the passage of time, has become obsolete. Man has to learn that language before he discovers that truth. But he has neither the means nor the leisure to embark on that course. We have therefore planned to help him acquire knowledge by an easier course. We have started the series of ancient Indian tradition and mythology in English translation. Our goal is to universalize knowledge through the most popular international medium of expression. The publication of the Puranas in English translation is a step towards that goal. Preface. The present volume contains the Brahmanda Purana, Part 5, Chapters 31 to 44 of the Lalita episode in English translation. It also embodies the general index of all the parts of this Purana. This is the 26th volume in the series on ancient Indian tradition and mythology. The project of the series was envisaged and planned in 1970 by Lala Sundar Lal Jain of Messrs. Motilal Banarasidas. Hitherto 25 volumes of the series, comprising English translation of Shiva, Linga, Bhagavata, Garuda, Narada, Kurma, and Brahmanda Puranas, have been published and released for sale. The present volume opens with Chapter 31. It describes Shripura or Srinagari, the capital city of the supreme goddess Sri Lalita and Lord Kameshwara, her consort. This city was built by Vishwakarman and Maya, the chief architects of Devas and Asuras. This city was built by Vishwakarman and Maya, the chief architects of Devas and Asuras, at the bidding of Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara, the trinity of gods recognized and accepted as the foremost deities in Indian religion. The gods had asked Lalita to divide herself into 16 forms, as they had planned 16 cities for her residence on earth at different sites. At the request of gods, Lalita divided herself into 16 forms and was named Shodashi. Of these 16 abodes, 9 were terrestrial and 7 were aquatic. The 9 sacred spots consisted of peaks of Meru, Nishada, Hemakuta, Himalaya, Gandhamadana, Neela, Mesa, Sringara, Shringa, and Mahindra mountains. 7 abodes were laid on the shores of 7 oceans, viz., the oceans of salt, sugar cane juice, liquor, ghee, curd, milk, and water. At these 16 spots were built 16 Shri Puras for Lalita. Lalita had different designations. She was called Nitya because she was the queen of Nitya Devis. The 16 cities of her residence became famous also by Nitya names. They were called Kameshwari Puri, Bhagamala Puri, Nitya Klinna Puri, so on and so forth. Shri Puras were well planned. They were encompassed by ramparts enclosures and walls of iron, bronze, lead, copper, silver, and gold. They were beautified by the gardens of heavenly trees Kalpa, Santana, Harichandana, Mandara, Parijata. By the side of Chintamani Graha, by the side of Chintamani Griha stood the palace of Mantrinatha, surrounded by the peak of Kadamba trees. There were barracks for the army personnel in the cantonment at Mahapadmatavi region in the grove of lotus flowers. Mantrinatha was the chief adviser to Queen Lalita. She was of dark complexion, Shyamangika, born of Matanga and Siddhimati. She was named Matangi. According to an anecdote, sage Matanga felt that he was inferior to his friend Himalaya because the latter was the father of Gauri. Therefore, he prayed to the goddess Mantrinatha to be born as his daughter so that he should feel himself equal to Himavat. The goddess was pleased to bless him and was born of Siddhimati, wife of Matanga, and was called Lagushyama. By her birth, as the daughter of Matanga, she sanctified the other daughters of Matanga, who also attained the status of Shaktis. Chapter 32 mentions 7 chambers and their respective enclosures with a guard to watch. In the first enclosure, beautified by the garden of many trees, Mahakala kept the watch. Being the presiding deity of Kala Chakra, where he occupied the central position, he looked deterrent, black colored, and boisterous. He was accompanied by a terrific spouse, Mahakali. The other 6 enclosures of chambers were watched by the 6 Indian seasons: Vasanta, spring; Grishma, summer; Varsha, rains; Sharad, autumn; Hemanta, early winter; and Shishira, winter. The respective positions of the guards in the enclosures ran thus: in the second enclosure, the spring season kept the watch in the Kalpakavati, the garden of wish-fulfilling trees. He was absorbed in the worship of Lalita. He had married Madhushri and Madhavashri. The third enclosure was watched by the summer season, who was stationed in Sanatana Vatika. He had married Nabhashri and Nabhasya Shri. The fourth enclosure was watched by the rainy season, who was stationed in the Harichandanavati. He had 2 wives, Shukashri and Shri Shuchishri. The fifth enclosure was watched by early winter, who was stationed in the park of Parijata trees. He had married Sahasri and Sahasyashri. The seventh enclosure was guarded by winter, who had married Tapashri and Tapasyashri. He sat in the Kadamba Vatika and kept watch over the enclosure assigned to him. Then there were chakras of the guardians of 7 chambers. At first, there was a circle of Mahakala which had 4 coverings with Vindu at the center, where Mahakala sat splendidly. The 4 coverings of Kala Chakra consisted of a 1 triangle, 2. Pentagon. 3. Lotus of 16 petals. 4. Lotus of 8 petals. To explain the Sandhyas, morning, noon and evening, were the Shaktis in the pentagon. Days, nights and the special days such as the full and the new moon days were the Shaktis in the lotus of 16 petals. Names of years in the Vedas were the Shaktis in the lotus of 8 petals. At some distance from the Kala Chakra, there stood the mystical circle of spring season. The deities stationed in this circle were 60. There were 30 tithis pertaining to Madhushri and 30 to Madhavashri. Thus, there were 6 chakras corresponding to 6 seasons. Each chakra had 60 Shaktis. The total number of Shaktis was 360, corresponding to 360 days of the year. In the same manner, there were deities in 7 enclosures. The material, chapter 33, the material of which these 7 enclosures were made consisted of precious stones, topaz, gold, rubies, gomeda, diamonds, lapis lazuli, sapphires and pearls. In the enclosure of topaz and gold there lived male and female siddhas. The enclosure of rubies was inhabited by birds. The enclosure of Gomeda was populated by yoginis, bhairavas, apsaras and gandharvas. The enclosure of diamond was stationed by kinnaras and kimpurushas. In the enclosure of lapis lazuli there lived nagas, sesha, karakotaka and others. In the enclosure of sapphire there lived asuras, Bali and others. In the enclosure of pearls there lived devas and guardians of quarters in their respective characters. Chapter 34. There was a chakra of 16 coverings with Rudra and Maharudra as the central presiding deities. Made of pearls, the chakra had 16 coverings. It had a seat in the middle on which Maharudra sat. In the triangle, which was the first covering, 3 Rudras were seated. They were Hiranyavahu, Senani, Dasampati. In the second covering, 6 Rudras were seated. In the third covering, 8 Rudras. In the fourth covering, 10. In the fifth covering, 12. In the sixth covering, 7. In the seventh covering, 16. In the eighth covering, 18. In the ninth covering, 20. In the 10th covering, 23. In the 11th covering, 24. In the 12th covering, 26. In the 13th, 28. In the 14th, 29. In the 15th, 32. In the 16th, 4. Dandanatha, chief of the army, had a chamber of emerald close to the palace of Lalita. She had a permanent home in the grove of lotus flowers where the barracks for the army were built, but since that mansion was far off from the place of Lalita, she had another mansion assigned to her for the purpose of serving her. A coral mansion was set apart for the Lord. A coral mansion was set apart for Lord Brahma, who came now and then from Brahmaloka in the company of leading sages for serving Lalita. In the mansion of ruby stones stayed Lord Vishnu, who came from Vishnuloka for the purpose of propitiating her. There was a lofty mansion with a 1,000-pillared hall for Lord Shiva to stay whenever he came to Shripura to visit her, in the company of Ganas, the chief of whom were Nandin, Bhringi, and Mahakala. Chapter 35. Lalita, identical with Chit Shakti, lay beyond the great hall of mind, Manas, beyond the sphere of intellect, Buddhi, beyond ego, Ahamkara, beyond moon god and sun god, and beyond love's flavor, Sringara. The spheres were difficult to cross, but the last one was very difficult to cross. There were 3 lakes that watered the region. The water of the lakes possessed properties of nectar, Amrita, bliss, Ananda, and discrimination, Vimarsha. The great deity, Tara, was the chief navigator in Amrita Lake, and Kurukulla was the chief of boats, Naukeshwari, in Vimarsha Lake. Mother Tara was the chief of Shaktis who rowed the boats. Her complexion was dark. She did not allow even the 3-eyed Lord Shiva to sail in the lake until and unless Mantrini and Dandinatha granted permission. In the enclosure to the chamber of the mind, Manasala, there was an enclosure known as the chamber of intellect, Buddhi Sala. The entire space in the middle of that chamber was occupied by the lake of bliss, Anandavapi. The goddess Varuni was the official in charge of the fleet of boats. She was called Shuddhamalini and also Amriteshwari. Only at the bidding of Mantrini and Dandanatha could she allow one to cross the lake. Even the 3-eyed Lord Shiva could not cross the lake without their permission. Within the enclosure of intellect, Buddhisala, there was the chamber of ego, Ahamkarasala. Between the 2 chambers, one of intellect and one of ego, there was the lake of deliberation and consideration, Vimarshavapi. The lady in charge of boats in this lake was Kurukulla. She was dark complexioned and clad in dark colored bodies. Within the enclosure of ego, there was the chamber of solar disk, Suryabimba Mahasala. The space within this chamber was occupied by Martanda Bhairava, who was accompanied by the Shaktis of fiery refulgence numbering several crores. He was of the form of great refulgence himself, Mahaprakasha Rupa Chakshushmati. He was accompanied by 3 Shaktis, Mahaprakasha, Chakshushmati, and Chaya. Within the enclosure of solar disk lay the chamber of lunar disk. The entire space within it was called the doorway of moonlight, Chandrikadvara, where the moon god performed penance. Here he stayed under the appellation Somanatha, surrounded by Shaktis of 27 constellations. Within the chamber of moon's disk was the chamber of the god of love. It was surrounded by the moat of amorous sentiments, Moha Shringara Parikha. Within the encircling moat filled with the essence of the sentiment of love, Shringara Rasa, there were Shringara Shaktis, haughty and intoxicated. They moved about in 1,000 boats and worshipped the flower weaponed Lord Kama, who was also intoxicated and seated in a boat. Subject to the control and commands of Lalita, Kameshwara enchanted the world by means of his arrows. Some Mohana and others which had the power of fascinating and deluding the people. The officer in charge of this moat was the god of love himself. Men of worldly inclination were not competent to cross this moat, which caused delusion even to matured minds. The officer in charge of this moat was the god of love himself. Neither devas nor human beings nor siddhas could reach the region of the lotus grove. Only Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesha, who were naturally pure in their minds, could go to this place, Mahapadmatavi, at her bidding. Within the chamber of Sringara was the great abode Chintamani Graha. The entire ground in its center was called Mahapadmatavi, which bestowed good fortune, exalted grandeur, and great felicity upon the visitor. The following gods served Lalita with their kalas: fire god with 10 kalas, the following gods served Lalita with their kalas: fire god with 10 kalas, sun god with 12 kalas, moon god with 16 kalas, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shankara with their respective kalas. The chambers were laid in Padmatavi. The interval of their joints was 1 yojana each. Such were the arrangements of chambers in the Mahapadmatavi region. Chapter 36. In the region of Mahapadmatavi there was Chintamani Griha, around which there stood splendid mansions, wherein dwelt the deities Mantrini, Dandanatha, Surya Grihini, Surya Grihini, Omkara, Turiya, Gayatri, Chakshushmati, Vishnu, Mahaganapati, Shiva, Trambaka, Saraswati, Dhisana, Matrika, Sampadeshi, Kalasankarshini, Shri Mahasambhunatha, Shri Paramba, Vishad Ajyotsna, Nirmala Vigraha, Vala, Annapurna, Hayaruda, Shri Paduka, Unmatta Bhairavi, Swapna Varahika, Tiraskarani Shri Putri, and Shri Mahapaduka. There were great mansions of Shri Rasmi Mala, Mantrinatha, Dandanatha, Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesha around Chintamani Griha. The abode was called Chintamani because it was solely made of Chintamani stones. It stood in the center of Sripura. It had 3 large crowns, symbolic of will, Ichha, action, Kriya, and knowledge, Jnana. The great goddess Lalita lived in the Chintamani house. She was waited upon by a number of Kalas, Yoginis and Gupta Yoginis, Shaktis and their attendant Shaktis, Chakrinis who presided over the Chakras, and Mudita deities who protected the Chakra. There dwelt a number of deities called Nathas who were expert in Yoga Shastra, who had founded and popularized Yoga Shastra, were instructors in mantra, were great oceans of all lores, and helped everyone in the fulfillment of desires. There were 4 Yoganathas created by Lord Kamesha for the protection of worlds. They were Mitresha, Uddisha, Shastesha, and Charya. There were 50 Nitya goddesses having the form of goddess Lalita, including Lalita in the form of Chit. Their number rose to 16. With her form like the luster of 1,000 midday suns, but cool like the moon, Lalita shone like the ocean of redness and reclined on the lap of her consort Kameshwara. Chapter 37. Though an all-pervading deity, Lalita sanctified certain places more efficaciously by her presence. There were as many as 50 sacred pithas of Sri Lalita. The chief among these was Vindunatha. In this principal pitha, known as Vindu Pitha, Shri Pitha, Vidya Pitha, or Ananda Pitha, there lay an excellent couch for Lalita. The couch had 4 legs in all the 4 directions. The leg in the southeast resembled Japa Kusuma, China rose, of which the presiding deity was Brahma. The leg in the southwest had the splendor of sapphire, of which the presiding deity was Vishnu. The leg in the northwest was as spotless as pure crystal, of which the presiding deity was Ishvara. Lalita shone in her full splendor in this pitha, along with her consort Kamesha. Strangely enough, Lalita and Kameshwara were 16 years old. Lalita was born of knowledge and consciousness. Kameshwara was born of the mind. Lalita presided over Srinagari or Sripuri, which was built by celestial artisans and craftsmen. Chapter 38. The mantras of Lalita are of 10 different types. Among these all, the mantra beginning with Ka, Kadi, and mantra beginning with Ha, Hadi, were most efficacious. These were known as Kamaraja and Lopamudra mantras. Kadi mantras of 15 syllables, Hadi mantra of 15 syllables. Kadi mantra of 15 syllables. Hadi mantra of 15 syllables. The only difference between Kadi and Hadi mantras is of 3 syllables. There were several methods for worshipping Lalita, several achievements acquired by the japa of her mantra. There were different ways of meditation on Lalita for different objectives or fruits. it was Lalita as Kamakshi who was eulogized by Brahma. Chapter 39. The primordial goddess had many forms and names. She was known as Kamakshi at Kanjivaram near Madras. This Kamakshi was different from the famous Kamakshi of Assam. Though both had emanated from the supreme goddess, Kamakshi was so called because Ka, goddess Saraswati, and Ma, goddess Lakshmi, were produced from her eyes, Akshi. Saraswati, Ka, entered the mouth of Brahma, and Lakshmi, Ma, rested on the chest of Vishnu, while the third-eyed god Shiva married Gauri. Chapter 40. Ancient Indian tradition records Kamakshi's wondrous performances. It so happened that once Parvati sportingly closed the two eyes, that is, the sun and the moon of Shiva, and thus committed the sin of dislocating the religious life of the world. Parvati was made to atone for it by penance on the Kampa river. Shiva, in his loneliness under Ekamra tree, performed penance at Kanchi. Due to Kamakshi's blessing, both were united forever. Once Bhairava plucked Brahma's head and committed sin. He was relieved of his sin through her grace. By her favor, sons were born to King Dasharatha, king of Ayodhya. By her favor, sons were born to King Dasaratha, king of Ayodhya. She united in marriage Lakshmi and Vishnu, Parvati and Shiva, Brahma and Saraswati. She employed Brahma in the task of creating the world, Vishnu in the task of sustaining it, and Shiva in the task of destroying it. At her bidding, Brahma stays in Brahmaloka, Vishnu in Vaikuntha, and Shiva at Kailasha. Ikshvaku, king of Ayodhya, built her a temple at Kanchi for sage Durvasas and his disciples for the purpose of worshipping her. Chapter 41. But to propitiate goddess Kamakshi, the procedural worship of Sri Chakra was very efficacious. Equally efficacious was the repetition of her mantra, which conferred benefits to the sadhaka and brought about ruin to the enemy. The worship was accompanied with many ifs. If a person endowed with devotion worshipped her continuously with no desire for return, or if he repeated her mantra for the prescribed number of time, or meditated upon her, it was thought that she herself would shoulder the burden of his will. To illustrate, just as the loving cow followed her calf, the goddess would follow her devotee who sought refuge in her. For seeking refuge, the refugee was asked to think about favorable things, avoid unfavorable ones, imbibe faith that goddess would protect him, solicit for her shelter, surrender his own self, and seek for compassion. Her mantra was the means to achieve worldly enjoyment as well as liberation from the tangle of rebirth. But for all such attainments, the devotee was to qualify himself for her worship. Chapter 42. A sadhaka was to perform mystical gestures with the fingers, mudras, whereby Sri Devi was delighted. The Purana recounts 9 mudras: Avahana, 1. Avahana, 2. Samkshobhini, 3. Vidravini or Dravini, 4. Akarshini, 5. Unmadini, 6. Mahankusha, 7. Kechari, 8. Yoni Mudra, 9. Vija Mudra. Outside this group of 9 there was Vidya Mudra. The later Tantric works mention 24 mudras. Among the mudras of this group, Yoni Mudra is the most important. Elsewhere, the Purana speaks of 10 mudras. They are Samkshobha, Dravana, Akara, Vashya, Unmada, Mahankusha, Kechari, Vija, Yoni, Trikhanda. Variations in the nomenclature of certain mudras may be noted. Chapter 43 to 44. Yoga was not a system to be learnt through books. It was a way of life to be lived through practice under the supervision of a preceptor. An aspirant had to approach a guru who was proficient in yogic parlor. Guru was the creator Brahma, sustainer Vishnu, and destroyer Shiva. Nay, he was the supreme Brahma. An aspirant had to pass through several stages of yogic activities before he realized the goal. The only person who could help him in the successful performance of these activities was the spiritual guide. As a disciple, he had to approach a qualified teacher, sit at his feet, learn from his mouth, and follow his ideal. Since initiation was the essential precondition to yogic siddhi, approach to an experienced initiator was the first step to accomplishment. The 2-syllabic word guru, gu, darkness, ru, one who dispels sin, signified a person who could dispel darkness. To make the aspirant sadhaka eligible to enter the spiritual path, the guru initiated him. There were 3 principal kinds of initiation which the disciple had to undergo. The first was an initiation by touching sparsha diksha. The second was an initiation by sight, digdrishti. The third was an initiation by mind, manasi drishti. Among these 3 kinds of initiation by mind was the best. Beside these 3, there was another kind of initiation by holy rites, diksha samskara, which was performed at the very beginning. No tantric sadhana was possible of achievement without the direction of a guru. To a sadhaka, the qualified guru was Lord Shiva himself, but without 3 eyes, Lord Vishnu himself, but without 4 arms, and Lord Brahma himself, but without 4 faces. In tantric sadhana, the worship of the deity was the second step. As the moon and the moonlight were inseparable, Lord Shiva and his Shakti were also inseparable. The Lord was therefore called Ardhanarishwara. But in spite of this invisibility, Shiva was worshipped all alone in most of the temples dedicated to him. Similarly, there were separate temples to Shakti where she was worshipped in one form or other, such as Durga, Kali, etc. According to Brahmanda Purana, there were crores of Shaktis, both principal and attendants. Yet Shakti was one. Ekaivaham jagatyatra dvitiya ka mamapara. Similarly, there were thousands of Rudras, forms of Shiva. Asamkhyata sahasrani ye Rudra adhibhumyam. Yet, at the base, Rudra was one. Eka eva Rudro vataste. Eka eva Rudro vataste na dityaha. The worship of any of the form of Shiva or Shakti was the worship of Shiva and his Shakti. The Shaiva Agama Shastras laid down a number of worship rites. Some of them were obligatory, nitya, others were needed for a particular situation, naimittika. A few others were meant for achieving desires, kamya. In all these rites, the disciple had to observe strict discipline, violation whereof made him a Brahmarakshasa. The rules of discipline were laid in the Agama Shastra. Guru was the person who enforced those rules. There were 16 ways of worshipping the deity. They included 1. Avahana, 2. Asana, 3. Padya, 4. Arghya, 5. Achamana, 6. Snana, 7. Vastra, 8. Bhusha, 9. Gandha, 10. Pushpa, 11. Dhupa, 12. Deepa, 13. Akshata, 14. Naivedya, 15. Tambula, 16. And Pradakshina. The worship of the deity was performed with 1000 syllabled mantra, Sahasrakshari Vidya, and concluded with the secret Kadi mantra. The rite of worship was not restricted to upper classes or to a particular sex. It was open to all, including women, Vaishyas, Shudras, and lower classes. A sadhaka of a low caste was to observe the same rites as the sadhaka of upper class, while paying homage to the deity who was to repeat the same activities. As a part of worship, he was asked to observe nyayas, nyasas and vinyasas with the letters of alphabets starting with a and ending with ksha. It was presumed that all letters of the alphabet were distributed on the nerve plexuses or the yogic chakras from the lowest Muladhara up to the Agya chakra, which carried the last two Haksha on its two petals. Meditation on the deity was the next step. It began with the deliberation on reality. Other sorts of deliberation were to be totally eschewed. Deliberation on japas was mediocre. On scriptures base, on earthly objects mean. For meditating on the deity, the formula evolved was you can meditate upon the deity after identifying yourself with the deity. Acknowledgement of obligations. It is our pleasant duty to put on record our sincere thanks to Dr. R.N. Dandekar and the UNESCO authorities for their kind encouragement and valuable help, which rendered this work more useful than it would otherwise have been. we are extremely grateful to Dr. G.V. Tagare for his critical introduction, prefix to part 1 of this Purana, lucid translation and comprehensive annotations. We thank Sri T.V. Parameshwar Iyer for his valuable assistance in the preparation of this work. We express our gratitude to all those persons who have offered suggestions for improving the same. Editor.